For our second event of the day, I bring you one of the most anticipated speakers of the summit, José Manuel Barroso. As one of the most accomplished leaders in recent history, I will try my best to summarize his illustrious career. He first became a member of the parliament in Portugal in 1985. He held senior positions in domestic politics, such as Minister of Foreign Affairs and Leader of the Opposition, before becoming the Prime Minister of Portugal. After 2 successful years in his capacity, he was nominated to be President of the European Commission in 2004. And after 5 years of successfully heading the EU, he was re elected for a second term, becoming only the second person in history to do so. In 2012, he accepted the Nobel Peace Prize on behalf of the Union. With a wealth of experience leading the world we currently live in, he has made decisions and implemented strategies that have affected our everyday lives. Currently, he is the chair of Goldman Sachs International and Gavi, the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization, which has been aiding worldwide vaccine distribution and is responsible for COVAX. We are fortunate enough to have him speak to us today. I could continue, however, I'm sure you are much more eager to hear from the leader himself. Please feel free to send in any questions you may have, and they will be answered after the talk. Without any further delay, the Warwick Economics Summit brings you José Manuel Barroso. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Iman, for your extremely kind words of introduction, and thank you to the Warwick's Economics Summit for the invitation. I know this is an initiative taken by the students, including some of my Portuguese friends there. They told me how important it was for me to be with you, and though I'm delighted to do it. As you've said, I'm a former politician, and so I thought appropriate to bring to an economic summit politics, because we cannot avoid politics, whether we like it or not. And so my idea is, in the first half an hour of this event now, to present you my view about the European process of integration from a structural point of view, how it develops, at least as how I see it, and also afterwards, hopefully during the period of questions, if you want, we can address some of the current, let's say, affairs concerning the European Union and the world. But I thought it would be interesting, now that I'm no longer in politics and that my level of sincerity is increasing day by day, to share with some distance my opinion about the way the European Union integration is facing its challenges from a structural point of view, also almost an historic point of view. And then we can also go more in detail on the current situation. For some years now, when we speak about Europe, namely about European Union, the first word that comes to mind is crisis. Crisis. All the time we speak about crisis. Radical changes in geopolitics and geoeconomics are stress testing the European Union, especially its political construction. It has become commonplace to criticize the populism, the nationalism, other isms that threaten the European Union. Indeed, these movements are threats to any democratic system. But it's true that they pose more difficult challenges to an entity that is precisely organized around principles and working methods that are transnational or even supranational by nature. It is now clear that the process of globalization that has been going on for some years has been creating feelings of insecurity among relatively large parts of the public in Western democracies, namely feelings of economic, cultural, or even physical insecurity, which are connected with, if not in part due to the perception of a loss of control of or threat to identity. It is well known that when there is a perception of an external threat, there is a closing, as people say in French, a repli sur soi, a folding or withdrawing into oneself, as one could observe very recently in the first reactions to the COVID-19 pandemic. One virus to which we have not yet found a vaccine is precisely nationalism. And we have seen the reactions all over the world. The first reactions were of nationalism. Afterwards, I believe we had some success in overcoming it. Certainly, this process has specific features in the European Union, and we have seen that in the seriousness of the financial and sovereign debt crisis in 2008 and the years afterwards, and the very high political and social costs of the so-called austerity policies. The economic inequality and the feelings of social injustice that arose contributed to considerable changes in political party systems and created problems in the legitimation of the process of European construction and European process overall. The increased polarization in the political system of several European countries, and also the growing polarization between the center and the periphery of Europe, as well as the self-inflicted divisions between debtors and creditors, should not be underestimated. Also, the massive and sudden influx of refugees and illegal migrants coming primarily from the Middle East and North Africa have increased problems of identity, especially in societies that had no recent experience of multiculturalism or with these problems between different ethnicities. And they have created new cleavages among European countries regarding the way in which this issue should be managed and distribution of the costs and responsibility of addressing these challenges, the integration of new migrants. The current crisis, the crisis we are living now, of course, has the strongest background, the pandemic, but is in fact still a continuation, and we still feel the effects of the financial and sovereign debt crisis in Europe, the refugee crisis, and also some others, and that has aggravated the cultural pessimism that was already present for some time, and has even raised some doubts about the European integration process as we have known it for the past few decades. However, against all predictions of doom, the euro area was able to resist all threats of implosion. Contrary to most market analysts' predictions and so many well-established and very respected economists, Greece continues to be a member of the euro, and the euro is indeed the second most important currency globally. So I think we should analyze that, and that's why I try to give a perspective from the medium term. Let me just share with you this point. In 2012, I invited to the headquarters of the European Commission in Brussels the most distinguished chief economists of the most important banks operating in Europe, including, by the way, one American bank. And I've asked them, it was a brainstorm, how many of you believe that Greece is going to remain in the euro? All of them, except one, said Greece will no longer be in the euro by the end of this year. We were in 2012. And after my second question was, how many of you believe that the euro will be able to resist the present crisis? Or are we going to see the end of the economic and monetary union? It was 50-50. Half of those very senior economists were predicting the collapse of the euro. They were wrong, and we should think why, and I believe the response is in politics. But there is also a point I want to underline is that the resilience of the euro and the European Union, in my opinion, is much greater than what is usually anticipated. But also in other areas, for instance, freedom of movement in the Schengen area, which many predicted was doomed to fail after the pressure of illegal migration and refugees, has indeed persisted. And Brexit of course was a very important moment. Until now we can say that Brexit has more, instead of being a virus for further disintegration of the European Union, has been acting as a vaccine against further exits. The reality is that the COVID-19 crisis now has also given rise to another leap in the process of European construction. It was the historic step of common debt issuance to finance the recovery. Today, the European Union, European Commission more precisely, is raising debt 750 billion euros in the markets on behalf of its member states. That was impossible some years ago. I remember some days ago, I was with Angela Merkel. She invited me just before leaving the chancellorship in Germany for a long and very nice dinner. And she said that now they were able to do what we have been asking during the financial crisis. You remember the famous Eurobonds. At that time, Germany and Angela Merkel, a very good friend, she said, only over my dead body. But now, of course, it was possible and it was necessary to do it. So it shows once again that when faced with a crisis, the European Union usually reacts for further steps forward in its integration. That's why I believe that only those who don't remember the Europe of the past can be so pessimistic about Europe of the present. Many tend to forget that it was in this very continent and in some of its most advanced regions that began the two most awful, devastating world wars in history. It was also here in Europe, in the cradle of democracy, human rights, and enlightenment, that we have witnessed the Shoah, one of the most painful, if not the worst, awful event in the history of mankind. The truth is that since the creation of the European community, there was never, between the countries that created it and those that joined it later, any armed conflict, which represents a very important exception in the centuries and centuries of bloody and violent history of the European peoples. This means that the central objective of European integration, peace, has until now been successfully attained. At the same time, we must, of course, avoid any form of complacency, even if there were not within the territory of the European Union. We cannot forget the tragic and recent conflicts in the Balkans, namely Bosnia, and the wars in Georgia and Ukraine, and now, of course, the situation so tense between Russia and Ukraine. But I repeat, in the European community and the European Union, there was, against all our history, there was not wars between the countries that are members of it. The Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to the European Union in 2012 precisely as recognition of its role in promoting peace in Europe and beyond. And when I had the honor to receive it on behalf of the European Union in 2012 in Oslo, I mentioned the very important contribution that the European process has made, not only to peace, but also to the intimate connection between peace and democracy and all the values that are at the core of the project. I know well that while this narrative is a motive and an underlying justification for the European Union, so democracy and peace, today this is no longer considered sufficient for the mobilization of support for the European integration process. And I also know that today the very idea of liberal democracy is being challenged, and I disagree with that. If we don't believe in democracy, it means we don't believe in our peoples. In that case, what are we doing there in politics? New generations who have no direct experience with the terrible aspects of war sometimes take for granted peace in Europe and peace in the European Union. This could be a very dangerous mistake. History shows that between nations, the rule is conflict. Tranquility, peace is an exception. It is important to constantly remember the great ambitions of the founding fathers of the European community, which was to attain the highest political goal, peace, through economic or technical methods, including the integration of markets and the creation of law with supranational status and nature. It is a mission and a vision that I believe remains perfectly valid today. I know there is resistance. Yes, there is always resistance where there is movement. And what we are seeing is precisely this resistance to the movement of integration. Europeans should value the fact that today war is unthinkable between what were once the greatest of enemies. This is not the case anywhere in the world. Economic growth has not resulted in diminished tensions or less mistrust between different powers, and we see a very unstable world also outside Europe and certainly outside the European Union. Still, in trying to compare the European Union situation today with its past, we need that historic perspective. For instance, when we compare it specifically to the situation of Europe in the 70s, 80s, or 90s, years that some present as the golden age of European integration. We should acknowledge that Europe is indeed today in much better shape than it was then. without mentioning the remarkable economic, cultural, social development in European countries, there was also extremely important progress from a political point of view. How can we forget the authoritarian regimes in South Europe, the totalitarian systems in Central and Eastern Europe, or the countries under Soviet control? Some of them were not even independent, and they are now members of the European Union. I know well that some voices in core European countries would prefer a smaller European Union, which will probably be more cozy, less diverse, and thus devoid of some of the problems of statecraft and governance, including challenges to the rule of law currently manifesting in some of the newer member states, challenges and problems that I believe are the biggest problem facing today the European Union, and I don't underestimate them. But I believe the critics of enlargement of the European Union are completely wrong when they think that the coherence of a small European Union will be an advantage compared to an amputated or divided Europe. Political decisions should always be assessed with counterfactuals, which means thinking in terms of alternatives. So, of course, we can see the problems of the European Union, but what we have to think is, would we be better if we had no European Union? That's the real point. The strategic decision that made the European Economic Community grow from its 6 original members to the 28 members that it had before Brexit was the right decision in political terms. I was precisely president of the European Commission since 2004. We were 15 members at that time. To 2014, we were at that time 28 members. So we have almost doubled in terms of number of members of the European Union during the financial crisis, during the refugee crisis, and so on and so forth. So I saw with my own eyes and through concrete experience how the European Union was able to gain this truly continental or almost continental nature. It is not to underestimate these serious difficulties that more recent enlargements have brought to the overall political atmosphere and also to the decision-making process, including at the level of the European Council. But the alternative to the enlargement will be a minor and fragmented Europe with less weight globally, and certainly it will have more difficulties in the defense of its values and its interests. The conflict in Ukraine and the Russian occupation of Crimea, as well as Russia's interventions in Georgia, have clearly demonstrated that if most Central and Eastern European countries had not been integrated in the European, or at least in the Euro-Atlantic space, the probability of much deeper and dangerous tensions and conflicts on the European continent would certainly be stronger and constitute a formidable threat to peace. Let's imagine for a moment that we had not had the enlargement of the European Union. Ukraine, as you know, is not a member of the European Union, but let's imagine that the Baltic countries were not members, that the Hungary, the Czech Republic, Poland, Slovakia, Slovenia were not members. Would we be better in terms of security, or would we probably be now confronting not one Ukrainian problem, but many, many Ukrainian type problems? That's the question. So it was right decision to enlarge the European Union and integrate those countries that were willing to do that and also that were fulfilling some criteria for that purpose. Without underestimating the difficulties, insufficiencies, or dysfunctions of the European Union, I have basically a positive assessment of the European integration process. I do not share the catastrophic or cataclysmic forecasts of European disintegration, which have become so widespread and which I believe to a large extent reflect the prevailing cultural atmosphere and also perhaps the pessimism that is also linked to the demographics of Europe. We have a demographic winter in Europe, and in fact that increases certainly the pessimism. And also the new problems of communication, not only the social media, but in general the communication, because the European Union is also a system of communication, and certainly one that in political terms we may consider particularly challenging. This is because there is not a true common European space, and because, as the great Italian intellectual Umberto Eco said, The language of Europe is translation. And I'm not only mentioning the difficulties of multilingualism, because that we can always use English as a kind of a lingua franca international language. It's not all the problem of multilingualism. What I mean now is the almost insurmountable challenge of politically translating a message for different European publics. Despite common interests, there are diverse cultures and perceptions, as well as stereotypes, prejudices, and national or regional biases that we find in countries that are so close yet so far apart. Not even the best communication or marketing campaign in the world will be able to solve the question of support for European integration if there is no solution for the most decisive question. And this is a political question. The political ownership of the European process by its stakeholders. And stakeholders of the European Union are not only the European institutions, as those in the Brussels-Strasbourg bubble sometimes think, but critically, the stakeholders are also the member states, the governments, and our societies. Brussels and Strasbourg alone cannot ensure the indispensable support for European integration. A technocratic or administrative consensus will no longer be sufficient. So we cannot have support for the European Union if the governments of Europe continue every time there is a difficulty to consider the European Union as a foreign power. That's exactly what Brexit has shown. And Brexit did not come as a complete surprise. Many of us, myself included, we have warned then Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, David Cameron, that organizing a referendum with the illusion that in a few months of a campaign for Europe, after so many decades of negative campaigning against Europe, it will be possible to overrule the perceptions. That was indeed an illusion. It was very risky, to say the least. The reality is that in the European Union countries, national politicians tend to Europeanize failure and nationalize success. And if that continues to be the trend, we will witness more problems of European legitimacy. The complexity and difficult legibility of the European Union will only be managed if there is political will. By definition, an hybrid democratic system with different levels of responsibility is very complex and hard to read and hard to interpret. That's why it is indispensable to understand that the European Union is not a state. But it is also not a classic international organization. It is a permanent scaffolding, not some kind of completed or perfect building. Its transitional character and incompleteness are essential features of the very nature of the European Union. As was anticipated by Jean Monnet, one of the founding fathers of the European Community, the European Community will be constructed in crises and through successive responses to successive crises. That is the reason why its decisions are too often frustratingly slow and fragmented. At the same time, the European Union has been able to show great elasticity and adaptability. We should not lose sight of the fact that when facing very deep internal changes and also transformative external challenges, a less centralized system is not necessarily less effective. On the contrary, an European Union with a high level of internal variety and increased pluralism in the decision-making process is sometimes better placed to deal with increased external complexity. It's true, democracies have an inherently relatively high degree of political instability, and the European Union, as a complex system with a transnational democratic polity that coexists with so many diverse national democracies, cannot escape the challenges associated with democratic instability and uncertainty. But in the medium to longer term, and that I'm inviting you to think in medium to longer term, democracies, if they are able to guarantee some level of social and economic cohesion, and that's a very important condition, can be more resilient and more stable than totalitarian systems. History shows that behind the semblance of unity, totalitarian systems typically hide deep vulnerabilities that may suddenly bring about drastic ruptures, cleavages, instead of the incremental changes we typically find in democracies and also in the European Union. These ruptures show the fundamental fragility of totalitarian systems. Generally speaking, totalitarian systems are much more fragile than democracies, and I think we should not forget this. European Union integration, as any regional integration process, is not just made up of spillover effects that would necessarily lead to a higher level of integration. In the end, what matters is politics and leadership. As we cannot anticipate the Philadelphia moment with the creation in the near future of the United States of Europe, what is reasonable to expect, I think what will be important to achieve, is the appropriation of the process of integration by its stakeholders and its explanation in terms of interests and values, and also sometimes trade-offs between the two, to the European citizens. The reality is that in a world where large powers are becoming much more assertive, aggressive, or unpredictable, Europeans will only be able to defend their interests if they were together. Quite obviously, even the biggest countries like Germany and France are not in the same league of global influence of the United States or China, for instance. That's why it is indispensable, if they want to defend their interests, to work together. That's why I believe that without that scale and leverage, they will have not the necessary weight to discuss in equal terms with the biggest powers. This is something I could see clearly, directly, when I participated in many summits of the G8, the G7, or the G20. Where was the real power of decision at global level? The two powers stand above the others in today's world, the United States and China. There is a third power that wants to show that it still matters, and it's Russia. And part of the problem we have today has precisely to do with that, with what was perceived by the Russian leadership as humiliation. When President Obama said Russia was a regional power, I think it was not the finest moment of President Obama. And in fact, now President Putin is showing that Russia needs some respect. And that's part of the problem today, because the current leader of Russia, whom I met many, many times, is essentially a product of resentment, nationalist resentment. And now we are watching, of course, the consequences of resentment. And I believe resentment between people or between countries is not good advice. That's why we have today to understand that we need a more political Europe. And I believe we are in a process of a European political coming of age. Once again, let's look at the words, because facts matter, but words also matter. Already for some time in European circles, we have been speaking about strategic autonomy, European sovereignty. The new president of the European Commission says she's committed to a more geopolitical commission. The concept of European sovereignty is now coming very current and very topical. This is not a new term. It was used already several decades ago by a federalist, Denis de Rougemont, and is very often a word used by President Macron from France. The rediscovery of the word sovereignty and its capture from those who are normally opposed to the European Union, from the far right to the far left, to reclaim it for the European camp and put it in a camp of those who want European integration, it's very interesting. It's a very interesting development, because it shows an European Union less idealistic and more realistic, if we may use this classic dichotomy. So the idea of sovereignty, in fact, was a French concept many years ago, was used against the European Union. Now what is happening is using sovereignty as a concept that precisely could bind together the countries of Europe. What we can see is a more political approach in matters that were previously dealt with in a more economic or technical view. From trade and competition to regulation in general, including, for instance, data protection, we can see a trend the European Union is becoming less naive when confronting other partners or competitors. The current pandemic is accelerating these trends. And in the present context of some deglobalization, the European Union, while remaining committed to an open global order, will certainly shape a more political attitude in its relations with other global players. It's quite interesting to see that the European Union that discovered that had no access to many of the treatments and vaccines and diagnostics when the pandemic came, was able in a relatively short time to become again the biggest exporter of vaccines. Today, the last figures I have it here show that the European Union is now the #1 exporter of vaccines in the world, ahead of China, the United States, Korea, or India. And that was not the case because there was a relocalization of some supply chains. It was in a relatively short period. And also, the great priorities today of policies of the European Union, I believe they are the right ones. The green transition, to fight climate change, where the European Union is in fact leading, since the Europe 2020 program that we have been leading, and in fact, with some difficulties, like the Convention of Paris that the United States had left some time, it is basically the European concept of fighting climate change, and that's now translated in the climate law of the European Union. That's a priority that we should pursue, and also the digital transition. But on the digital transition, clearly, the European Union is behind the United States and many others, and that is the point where I believe there are some clear weaknesses in Europe. It is on technology and on the financial markets. Technology, not so much in science, because in scientific production, the European Union is not behind others. In fact, we could say numbers of articles published in the best scientific journals, it's ahead. The difficulty is in translation from the laboratory to the market on innovation, where the European Union is still behind some of its partners or global competitors. And also, in terms of the financial markets and financial integration, that of course that creates a difficult situation when it comes to innovation. But on other areas, I believe the priorities are the right ones, and also on the hard issues of foreign policy and security and defense, we will see some progress. Some steps have already been taken in the direction of a strong European identity in terms of security and defense. They are certainly minor compared with the ambitions proclaimed by many, but what counts here is the direction of travel. It seems reasonable to predict that we will continue to see an incremental approach to foreign policy and security and defense matters in the European Union. There will certainly be coalitions of the willing in some areas, this being fully compatible with European treaties provisions of enhanced cooperation. Most probably, these coalitions of the willing may include non-European Union countries, namely the UK, if the UK so wishes. The precise content and scope of the European Union-UK relationship in security and defense, as well as in foreign policy, will be one of the more interesting developments to watch. Unfortunately, we are still not there because of issues that are not yet settled concerning the so-called Brexit process. We will also probably find some of the taboos of the past to be broken, including the way in which Germany, which is being increasingly asked to play a more active role internationally, will face its defense and security responsibilities. As you know, the United States has been urging Europe to commit more resources to NATO and to defense. This is not new. I have heard every American president before Trump mention the same in all NATO summits I had attended. But what was true with Trump was the very idiosyncratic manner in what he was, in how he was doing it, including, of course, in a confrontational attitude to Europe, to Germany, and to some of the biggest European countries. But the reality is that if the Europeans, and more specifically the Germans, deliver on the commitment to spend 2% of GDP on defense, it will certainly be an important step for a stronger European defense. And this, coupled with the need to build European defense capabilities in a more mutualized way, will be an important trigger for additional steps in security and defense that, while incremental in nature, will mostly likely shape a clear European identity. I want to underline, not against NATO. I do not believe the European Union countries will be accepting the idea of replacing NATO. So the idea of strategic autonomy, probably it's an excessive concept when it comes to defense and security, but it is possible in the framework of the transatlantic defense and security systems to build a stronger European identity. And I believe this is, I repeat, the direction of travel. As we have been seeing throughout the pandemic, some events may accelerate what is happening. And I think the pandemic is having an acceleration effect. The pressure from the European Union's immediate neighborhood, namely Russia, but also Middle East, North Africa and Africa, as well as the growing global tensions and uncertainty, will most probably encourage the European Union and its member states to consider bolder steps in terms of their security. The founding fathers of the European community famously advocated a step-by-step approach to European integration. And we will continue to see this approach. I believe Europe, we are not going to have the United States of Europe in the foreseeable future. It will be a step-by-step. But the geopolitical developments seem to indicate we are in one of those moments in history where the European Union will need a bigger step than usual. I thank you very much for your attention. I'm now ready for your comments or your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Professor. We are incredibly grateful to have this opportunity, and you have certainly left us with a lot to reflect on. Our first question is, do you think that common debt issuance will lead to further fiscal integration in Europe? And at what pace do you think this will happen?
I think something will come out of this. That was presented as a one-off. As I've told you, I remember well when I was in the Commission, we and others, we were pushing some of our member states to accept the very idea of mutualization of debt. At that time, it was not accepted. Our understanding in the European Commission was that if you have a common currency, we need to have some forms of mutualization of debt, and it is unavoidable. And that's why now, when facing the pandemic, the countries, including Germany was in fact leading that camp, accepted the debt mutualization was a very big step forward. Now there is a process going on in the European Union. The European Commission will come very soon with proposals of a revision of Stability and Growth Pact. I believe there will be not a dramatic change in terms of changing the treaties, because the countries of Europe do not want to now open a process of revision of the treaties. As you know, this is a very traumatic and difficult process. It requires unanimity. But I believe with the usual European legal creativity, lawyers are very inventive sometimes, there will be some ways of flexibility for the Stability and Growth Pact. And I'm saying that why? Because I think that there will be a great negotiation, a kind of a package negotiation, as sometimes happens in Europe, linking the revision of the pact to some fiscal capacity. One thing I believe it's important to note, and it's not only in the European Union, sometimes when we have a problem to solve, the best way to solve it is to enlarge it. This is counterintuitive, but why? Because if we enlarge the problem, we have more possible trade-offs and more people or players interested in its solution. So that's what we have done, by the way, when we presented the famous European Union package against climate change. It was not just against climate change, it was about energy security. So because we needed to have the support of countries like the new member states that were not so much in favor of ambition in climate change, but they were demandeurs in terms of energy security. So, and the same is going to happen now is, I believe, about the fiscal capacity. Are we ready for some fiscal capacity? If you are ready for some more fiscal rigor. And that's what the so-called frugal countries will ask from the others. So it will be at the end some kind of compromise, but it's not yet sure how far we are going for the fiscal capacity of the European Union, but the trend will certainly be in that direction.
Thank you for that. Our second question is very popular amongst our viewers. They want to know, should the European community accept Turkey and Ukraine to strengthen collective ideologies, or should it focus on integration within current members?
Turkey and the European Turkey is a candidate for a long time. It's in fact the country that has been posed its candidature longer ago. But for the evolutions of Turkey that are unfortunately quite clear now, it's not possible to contemplate the Turkish membership of the European Union. And Ukraine also is not going to be a member of the European Union. What happened in Ukraine, and it's very important to understand what's going on with Russia, was that Ukraine asked to become a member of the European Union, but in fact they did not meet the criteria. The systemic corruption in Ukraine, it's quite obvious, and the other fragility of the institutions. But we told them, we cannot offer you membership, but we can offer you an association agreement. Basically, it was a free trade agreement with some political cooperation. And they've done it, and we have done it. But then at the moment of signing, there was pressure from Russia, President Yanukovych, and they rejected to signing. And that's what created afterwards the Maidan process and all the problems. And afterwards, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia and annexation of Crimea. And that was, in fact, a change in the position of Russia, because Russia was, and Putin said it to me several times, and he publicly said it, that in principle, he was not against the European integration of Ukraine. What was against is against Ukraine integration in NATO. So in fact, the problem was that at some point, the Russian leadership understood that Ukrainian becoming a member of the European Union will most likely become also a member of NATO, and they don't accept that. But also, we have not offered that to Ukraine, European membership, because we believe they were not in that position. But even something less ambitious, like the association agreement, was rejected by the president of Ukraine at that time. That, of course, afterwards was rejected by its own people, because he was, in fact, doing what the Russians wanted. And that was the crisis of Ukraine as we know it. So I don't believe, at least in the foreseeable future, that we'll see Ukraine member of the European Union. What I believe is that Ukraine wants to be closer and closer to the European Union and to the West for obvious reasons. They know, for instance, the evolution. They see the growth, spectacular growth of Poland compared to their own situation. And so I believe that Ukraine should be as close as possible to the European Union, but that does not mean membership of the European Union.
Thank you very much for that. Our next question is leading on from this. Even if Russia finds a diplomatic solution to the situation in Ukraine, how can Russia and the EU develop a positive relationship? And what does Russia stand to gain from that?
Look, we have tried. To be very honest, and that's the advantage of no longer being in politics, I can be very sincere, not saying something in contradiction of what I was saying before, but I can be more explicit. We have tried everything to have a good relationship with Russia. I mean the Europeans. There was, for instance, an agreement for a pact for modernization made during the times Medvedev was president, but in fact, Putin was always in power. Even when he was prime minister, he was decisive force. So it was certainly with Putin's blessing, and we have tried. But I believe at some point, some developments in Russia, probably linked to the control of power in Russia and the evolution of Russia to a more autocratic system, and they did not embrace the idea of modernization and becoming a country like other countries we have in Europe or in the West in general. And it's a tragedy, because Russia is a great country, is a country with a great people. They have shown one of the greatest resilience in history. It's the biggest country in the world in terms of geographical dimension. And from Napoleon to Hitler, I think it was clear that it's a country that should be respected. Having said, and it's part of the European civilization, Russia. I have no doubts to say it. It's part of the European civilization. Now, the question is that, as it happened sometimes in the past, where there were attempts to modernize Russia, sometimes in an authoritarian way, but modernize Russia, for instance, with Peter the Great and others, now, once again, Russia has missed the opportunity for modernization. And so we are going to have this confrontation. I hope we avoid real confrontation. I believe it's not in the interest of Russia or the Europeans or the world in general to have a war now between Russia and Ukraine. I think it will be extremely detrimental to Europe and to the world. And I continue to think that that's not the most likely scenario. So we have to use diplomacy. That's what diplomacy is for. Some compromise where no one loses its face, but where we understand that a war will not bring any advantage to Russia, not to Ukraine, certainly not to Europe or to NATO. So I believe it's through compromise, political engagement, of course, with clear positions, not giving up. There are principles where Europe and NATO should not give up, but I believe through compromise and diplomacy, we could and should avoid open, let's say, generalized conflict with Russia.
Thank you. Our next question is focusing more on Europe. What can Europe teach us about coexistence and compromise in an increasingly globalized world?
I think by definition, Europe is a compromise. The word compromise in English, and I believe also in most European languages, at least ones I know from my own Portuguese to French to Spanish or Italian and even German, it has sometimes a negative connotation. It's we are compromising something. We are not defending our principles completely. No, I think there is pragmatism with principles. And by definition, the European Union, I've seen that all my life, not only when I was leading the European Commission, but also the 12 years I was in my own government, in my country, in different capacities. I was participating in the European Council or the European Council of Ministers. By definition, the European Union has to come to compromise. When you have 28 or now 27 countries around the table, even the biggest countries, they understand that they cannot impose their views. I can tell you from experience, they understand that they make big concessions sometimes, and that's the way it is. And there is that culture of compromise. Now, sometimes there are difficult moments, very difficult moments. I've mentioned around the rule of law, for instance, but I believe at the end, and that what counts is the final result, at the end, the European Union has been able to reach some consensus in some of the most difficult issues, and I believe that will continue to be like that. If not, then we'll have a real problem for the European Union, and it's detrimental not only for the European Union, but for the countries that will block this indispensable consensus.
Thank you. You mentioned the special relationship between periphery and core countries and that it should not be underestimated. How do we go about leveling target 2 balances?
I don't understand exactly the question. It's about the monetary issue, or is it in general political? I mean, if it's a general political thing, I believe, as I've told you, that there are sufficient concessions, and there will be, because the European Union, it's a permanent negotiation. So it's the different countries, they also need the support. Just to give an example, Poland now is very criticized because of difficulties with what most countries assert as the rule of law. But Poland, in a way, it's in a minority, but Poland needs the support of the other countries, not only financially, where it's the biggest recipient of European Union funds, but geopolitically, as we are seeing now with Russia. Poland and Lithuania are certainly the countries that feel most, probably, I mean, I would say also the other Baltic countries, the Russian pressure. So they need the others. So from that point of view, Poland is certainly not the periphery. Poland is at the center of Europe. The South European countries that were very much affected by the sovereign debt crisis and financial crisis are also essential for the making of consensus. I mean, Italy is one of the biggest economies in the world. And in fact, we have seen now during the pandemic that one of the reasons why probably the European Union were this time was quicker to accept mutualization of debt and to accept some bolder steps was the fact that the center of the epidemic in Europe was precisely Italy. And northern Italy is one of the economic powerhouses of the European Union. So there will be always this kind of compromises. And it's quite interesting to see also the role of France, because France is a country that is at the same time probably the only one that is north and south in Europe. Germany is north, Italy is south, but France is a country in the North Sea, I mean, very close to the UK, but also Mediterranean country. And it's a country that, in fact, if it comes to an agreement with Germany, today it's very difficult afterwards that agreement not to be translated in an overall consensus. Or, as always, with some concessions and giving up something to those who can be more reluctant to find the common ground. So this is why I think that tension exists. That was aggravated by the financial crisis. We cannot underestimate it. But as we have seen also in some recent decisions, it was possible to overcome those tensions between center and periphery and to achieve it. From a monetary point of view, if that was the question, I mean, DCB has a mandate. The mandate is, of course, to keep the stability, monetary stability, and euro. And euro, of course, it's again indispensable for the future of the euro, solidarity and coherence. If there is a deep cleavage between the periphery and the center, then the euro will be at risk. And that's certainly not what the major stakeholder in economic terms of Europe, Germany, wants. Germany, I believe they are very sincere in linking the future of their country to the future of the European Union and the future of the Economic and Monetary Union.
Thank you so much for that answer. Unfortunately, we are out of time for the Q&A, but it was incredible having you here, and we are so grateful that you were speaking to us today.
Thank you. My pleasure.